Well, hello there, dear friends. Welcome to video 4 of my new series on stories that unite during dark times. Thank you especially to my newsletter readers and Patreon supporters, my dear patrons, who have inspired and challenged me a lot as I've been doing these videos. The back and forth has been wonderful. The back and forth has been challenging for me. I've had to really dig deep and think about what it is that I'm saying and why it is that I'm saying these things. And again, I extend the invitation out to all of you who are watching this. There is at least one video left in the series, possibly two. I haven't decided yet. Maybe even three. Who knows? But at this point, it's going to be 5 total. So you have one more left if you want to watch the live stream happen in person and be able to comment on it before I actually release it to the larger newsletter audience. So patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar. That's where we meet. So this week especially has been very interesting to me. Oftentimes when I do these things, when I do these live streams, these videos, and sometimes when I do my podcast episodes for In a Certain Kingdom, it's really interesting to see how information just kind of percolates from different places and from very unexpected sources in ways that help uphold and fill out the gaps in my knowledge about the things that I'm talking about in very unexpected and interesting ways. I think a lot of people nowadays like to talk about things like synchronicity. I have used that word before, or serendipity. Those two S words are very, very popular these days. But I don't think that's it. I mean, there's certainly an element of awareness and attention that happens. Human beings are very attentive creatures when they want to be. And I think that simply being aware and attentive oftentimes not so much attracts information to you, but just makes you aware of connections that are there in the first place. It's the way the world is. The world is patterned. Reality, as Jonathan Peugeot likes to talk about, it manifests itself as a series of patterns. So I think this is just a manifestation of reality. When we really pay attention, when we are attentive, things start to percolate. They start to approach us. They start to present themselves to us in interesting ways. That certainly happened to me. And I want to begin today's video by talking about a different way of visualizing what it is I'm talking about here in this series of videos. I think I've made a good argument so far in terms of explaining what the problem is and what the possible solution might be. But I still continue to get the nagging feeling that I'm not being specific enough or deep enough when it comes to what I actually want for all of you when you come out through this process that I'm trying to lead you through. And at least partially, part of the problem, I think, is that I may have been not accurate completely in the way that I'm formulating this, the process through which story can help us become rooted people who are then open and able to make connections with others. And partially, I think it's my love for the imagery of the journey. And last time, I emphasized the fact that in order to become fully rooted human beings who are not buffered individuals, as Charles Taylor would have it, but who are partaking in a rich experience of what it means to be human through the medium of story, shared storytelling traditions, I then suggested that we can return back into the power of the individual through the literary invention, as Angus Fletcher would have it, of the literary narrator who has his own voice that's separate from your own personal voice. The argument I was making was that it's a kind of a journey away from the comforting womb, so to speak, or the world of archetypes, or as one of my readers suggested, the world of types, which is possibly an even better way of describing it, into a more individuated world where we can now encounter the dangers that we see in our daily life every day, and find courage and strength to deal with it through the medium of more specific heroic storytelling, as it has come down to us in the tradition of epic poetry. Things like the Iliad, the Aeneid, Beowulf, and the Russian epic heroic folktales. My mistake, I think, is in trying to describe this as a journey outward from the womb into, I guess, a more advanced or a more progressed state. And that's That's the intrinsic problem of being a modern person living in a postmodern world, where the categories and the way of thinking of the enlightened world, not the old world, are ingrained in me. A progressive mindset, a mindset of progression from something that is more primitive to something that's more advanced. That's not at all what I wanted to suggest. So I want to fix that mistake immediately. Jordan Peterson talked in his conversation with Angus Fletcher, which I've shared with you before, about different levels of storytelling that humanity exists in. And he talks about it as being nested within layers of meaning that is presented through the medium of stories. And this idea of being nested in layers is much closer to what I'm getting at here. It's almost like one of those Russian nesting dolls, right? Where it's one doll, but it's many, right? When you're looking at it from the outside, it just seems to be one thing, but you keep uncovering it and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Now imagine if the heart of it was the sort of the most complex and the deepest and the most beautiful part, the small, tiny little bit. If that were possible, that's sort of what I'm talking about here. That's fairy tales. That's the richest, that's the most dangerous in some sense, but also safest. Dangerous in the sense that you have to agree to leave the confines of rational reality and go into this world of types, this world where great vast swaths of emotion are encapsulated in single actions and in single characters. If that tiny little center of the nesting doll were the largest, the most fecund, the richest part, that would be a good metaphor. So, which is actually, if you're paying attention, if you have read my books, this is also a metaphor that I've used extensively in the Song of the Syrian and in the Raven Sun series at large. And I was surprised to realize when I reread The Last Battle to my kids that that's an image, the onion that gets unpeeled and every layer is larger than the one inside. That's an image from The Last Battle. I didn't even realize I appropriated a C.S. Lewis image. And it was kind of embarrassing after I'd read my entire series to realize that I've actually, I cheated and I took an image from C.S. Lewis without even realizing it. I mean, it was sitting there in my subconscious. I didn't realize that that's what I'd done. So that's a better way of looking at it. But an even better one, and a more natural one, and a more rooted one, is something that I just happened to read just an hour ago. I recently got this wonderful, you're going to see this backwards, I'm afraid. I'm not going to flip the camera just for this, so I apologize. But this is a collection of essays by Wendell Berry, as selected by Paul Kingsnorth, of all people, which I was very happy to see. Not the reason I bought it, but when I got it, I realized that's what it was. I was very happy. It's called The World Ending Fire, The Essential Wendell Berry. And in this collection, there is an essay that I just started to read. It's called The Work of Local Culture. And he talks in this, and I'm going to get into this deeper, I think, in the last video, but there's this wonderful image that he talks about. He talks about this bucket, this old bucket that has been hanging on a post for something like 50 years. And here's how he describes it. The old bucket was hung there through many autumns, he says, and the leaves have fallen around it, and some have fallen into it. Rain and snow have fallen into it, and the fallen leaves have held the moisture and so have rotted. Nuts have fallen into it, or have been carried into it by squirrels. Mice and squirrels have eaten the meat of the nuts and left the shells. They and other animals have left their droppings. Insects have flown into the bucket and died and decayed. Birds have scratched in it and left their droppings, or perhaps a feather or two. This slow work of growth and death, gravity and decay, which is the chief work of the world, has by now produced in the bottom of the bucket several inches of black humus. And those of you who have done any gardening know that that's the richest kind of soil. It's the best kind of soil for anything that grows. However small a landmark the old bucket is, it is not trivial. It is one of the signs by which I know my country and myself. And to me, it is irresistibly suggestive in the way it collects leaves and other woodland sheddings as they fall through time. It collects stories, too, as they fall through time. It is irresistibly metaphorical. He suggested the metaphor, and I'm going with it. So I think it's fair to now reveal what I really hope that you will come away with when you go through this series. I'm not really merely interested in giving you, my dear viewers, a kind of list of stories that will unite you during dark times. No. That's only part of the deal. What I really hope for you is that you decide that you want to become the focal point of local culture. That you decide that this world that we live in, the madness of the particular moment in which we live is so insane. It's so crazy. It's so out there that really the only way to affect change is not by joining great movements or by starting a revolution. It's by becoming the cultural change you want to see around you. Now, I'll be honest, this is something that is going to be irresistibly awful for you if you choose to do this, because it's going to take a long time for any seeds that you put into the ground to actually sprout, hundreds of years. So whatever you do, you most likely will not see the fruits of it in your own lifetime. You may see some of it, but you probably won't see the real flowering of it. But I remind you that this used to be normal in the Middle Ages. The great cathedrals that we now go to and are completely awed by were built by generations. The people who started it knew they would not see it. Then the next generation of builders knew that they would not see it, that only their children would. So the grandchildren of those who started, the stonemasons who started putting those stones together, knew that they were building for a future that was 100 years down the line. I think we need to start thinking about our particular historical moment in those terms. So I hope that what I suggest to you is not trite, even though it might sound sometimes like, oh, that's all he's going to say? Read fairy tales, read epic poetry. Isn't that the kind of stuff we heard in high school from our teachers? Assuming you went to that kind of high school, of course. If you didn't, that's okay. But I mean, isn't this what every traditionalist of a particularly annoying stripe has been suggesting since the beginning of time? Just read more old books. Well, I'm suggesting that that's step one, but I'm not suggesting that's an end in itself. I'm suggesting that there actually is a way for each one of us individually to become a kind of bucket for hummus to be made in. And that hummus is the kind of culture that changes hearts. And by the way, the first heart that it changes is our own. So even if nothing ever happens around us as a result of our attempting to make this epochal change within ourselves, at the very least, we've done something to save ourselves in the midst of all this madness. That's really the thought I wanted to remind you of. That's the reason I'm doing this video. I don't have a 5-step program. I may have suggested that I did last year's series of videos. What I want for you here is a different way of relating to the great richness of storytelling that we have received as 21st century modern people. Nobody in the history of mankind has the access to story that we have. And it's really quite sad how so many of us are distracted by information. As T.S. Eliot would have it, where's the knowledge we have lost in information? I think that's from the Hollow Men. But it needn't be that way. Let's do something about it. Let's start with ourselves. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. And to get a little more specific, I wanted to share some thoughts from a conversation between English professor Alan Jacobs and the editor of Plough magazine. Alan Jacobs has just written a book called Breaking Bread with the Dead. Great title. A Reader's Guide to a More Tranquil Mind. That's unexpected. Tranquility, talking to the dead. What's he talking about? Well, to the question, answering to the question, what was the inspiration for this book? This is what he said. This was a book I started thinking about as I was putting the final touches to an earlier book called How to Think. How to Think was a book that I wrote just as the presidential campaign of 2016 started to heat up. I started to see people not thinking very well and getting really agitated and emotional and defensive and prone to mischaracterize the views of others. In my years of teaching, I have learned a lot about the ways in which thinking can go wrong and how those problems might be addressed. Thought this would be a good time for me to write, not so much as a scholar or a Christian, he is both, because those are the ways in which I often write, but rather to think of myself primarily as a citizen and to try to find a word that would be helpful to my fellow citizens at a time of increasing tension, anxiety, and anger. By the way, that's what I'm trying to do here, in case you haven't noticed, but enough about me. Even as I was finishing the book, he continues, one of the things that I felt I had neglected, at least to some extent, was what can be done to break the habits of instantaneous emotional response to whatever happens to come across our newsfeed. Now, this was not getting better after 2016, but was in fact getting worse. Now it's at fever pitch. Now, this is really interesting what he says. One of the ways I sometimes describe this is to say that everyone who has ever had to raise children knows that it doesn't work just to tell them, don't do X. You need to be able to say, do Y instead, do Z instead. Oh, good Lord. Ain't that the truth? Let me tell you as a father of four, that's the truth. You need to be able to give them some alternatives to the annoying or dangerous thing that they're doing. It's one thing to say, don't be on Twitter so much, don't be on Facebook so much. What are you going to do instead? There are many things you could do instead. One that I think is especially useful is consulting voices from the past. And this is the main point I wanted to impart to you today. If you accept my model in which, in order to get out of the madness of the current moment that we're in, which is a madness of us being really, really powerfully and traumatically alone in a world that doesn't allow us to be in community with anyone, we need to really re-engineer the way we interact with the world around us, starting by cutting off this buffered self kind of relationship to the world outside and re-engaging with the world of fairy tales because of their ability to heal broken hearts and warm them in such a way to remind us that we are members of a larger community of humanity that has been telling these stories for a long time. And then to find the specific and individual courage that is given to us by the great and, yes, flawed works of epic poetry of the past. The reason I mentioned that they are flawed is because one of my readers actually made a good point, and that's that many of these epic heroic poems have a worldview that is essentially hopeless. The Iliad is not a hopeful tale. Even the Odyssey is not a hopeful tale, although it is a traditional hero's journey, and we do have a triumphant, almost catastrophic end, as Tolkien would have it. It still ends, for those who know, with Ulysses' continued inability to be calm and happy in his return home, or at least in some versions of the story. And there is this essential darkness, this essential hopelessness at the heart of the ancient epic tales. And that hopelessness, of course, has to do with the pagan worldview, which was essentially cyclical and didn't see a way out of the constant and endless cycle of life and death, and not rebirth. Rebirth sometimes, but even that rebirth was not the kind that could transcend one's own weaknesses. This is true. This is definitely a weakness of that particular strain of literature. Which is why, if we are continuing the metaphor of the bucket, the really great stuff, the hummus, is the fairy tales. The next level up is the stuff that's starting to get a little bit better. It's not quite at hummus level, but it's not really on the level of mouse droppings either, right? That's epic heroic poetry. It's kind of gross, it's kind of icky, but it's getting to the place of healing that fairy tales can provide you. Above that is the layer of everybody dropping stuff in. It's got mouse droppings, it's got fish, it's got bird droppings, it's got bits of dead leaves, dead acorns and stuff like this, right? Some of those things are wholesome. Some of the things have life in them. Some of them are seeds. Some of them are things that come from decay. Some of them are droppings, right? But all of them eventually can, if properly let sit through the great equalizer of time, can become something that is then very rich to us. This is literature. This is the genre, if you will, of the classics. These are the stories that are much more specific and much less universal than fairy tales, much more dependent on a particular historical and cultural time and mindset, and so not necessarily accessible to everyone universally. It's an experimental form. As we know, hopefully you do know this, that the novel itself, which is perhaps the purest form of literature in the proper sense, is a very, very recent invention and maybe on its way out already. But that's neither here nor there. Literature, as in its proper domain, is a domain of experimentation. And those who have studied literature know this. The farther you get into the historical development of literature, the crazier the devices that authors actually use, and the more difficult the books become to actually move you and transform you. By the time you get to the 20th century, to the literary fiction of the latter half of the 20th century, the kind of literature that used to transcend people by the reading of it has lost its power to do that completely. A point that I've made in other places, and I will continue to make, I think, in this series of videos later. But there was a moment, but there are still moments throughout that whole process of history, from the ancient times to a arbitrarily chosen moment sometime in the 19th, 20th century, where the classics cease to be classics and become contemporary literature. That's entirely a personal choice as far as I'm concerned. All that stuff, all those centuries, even millennia of stories, of works of literature, they are there to be mined, and they are all experimental in nature. They're all there, and they're all of varying degrees of effectiveness when it comes to actually helping you to leave the comforting confines of fairy tale land and go out into the dangerous world. So this is like, returning back to the metaphor of the journey, this is like the try-fail sequence of the hero's journey. This is you going out into the wilderness and failing repeatedly. That's how I think it would be interesting. I hope you find it an interesting image. That's how I interact with classical literature. I think that's how a lot of people do. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's maddening. If you've read any of the longer works of Charles Dickens, it takes till about page 300 for you to really start feeling like your heart is being seriously transformed. But once you get there, that experience is something that is not comparable with almost anything else, other than perhaps worship, which of course is a far greater thing than reading literature. But some things leave you cold. So how do you determine what's the thing that you need to read? Well, I have some thoughts that I got from a wonderful essay by the Italian writer Italo Calvino in an essay that he wrote for the New York Review of Books in 1986 called "Why Should We Read the Classics?" Here's some of his thoughts of how you find the classics and how we should read them. And I'm not going to comment on them. I'm just going to read them because I think this video's gone on long enough. I just want you to consider these ideas, and if you like them, read the whole essay. It's short and it's quite good. And then I'll finish up after that. So here's what he has to say. The classics are books that exert a peculiar influence, both when they refuse to be eradicated from the mind and when they conceal themselves in the folds of memory, camouflaging themselves as the collective or individual unconscious. That's what happened to me when I unconsciously used an image from The Last Battle, which I do consider to be a classic, even though I don't think it's his best work, for sure, C.S. Lewis's best work. Here's another thought. The classics are the books that come down to us bearing upon them the traces of readings previous to ours, and bringing in their wake the traces they themselves have left on the culture or cultures they have passed through, or more simply language and customs. When we use the word classic of a book that takes the form of an... here's a good one. We use the word classic of a book that takes the form of an equivalent to the universe. In that one sentence, Calvino, I said I wouldn't comment. I will comment. Calvino really brings to a head what I'm talking about. My argument here, my argument that we need to interact with stories in a more active way now in this particular historical moment, has to do with the fact that no one has ever said that a streaming series or a movie contains within itself the form of an equivalent to the universe. Nobody will ever say that, because the medium is not the kind of medium to effect such transcendence. There are some things that really powerfully can affect you. Absolutely. The films of Tarkovsky, right up there. But they still don't compare with the deep, profound effect that a good book can have on a person. There are good reasons for this. They are biological, they are cultural, they are spiritual, they are physical. All of them. I have talked about this at length in other places. I'm not going to rehash my arguments. If you find this interesting, I recommend you look up Why Becoming a Storyteller May Be the Most Important Thing in Your Life on my website. It's a lecture that I gave about a year ago, 2 years ago now. I don't know. Time gone crazy since the pandemic. There's nothing like the potential of a book to be a universe. And that's particularly important now, because that means that you can have an experience that can change you to your core simply by opening a bunch of papers together and forcing yourself to go through something that's quite enjoyable. As C.S. Lewis said, in reading literature, I become 1,000 men, and yet I remain myself. What time, if not now, do we all, each one of us individually, need to shove into ourselves the collected wisdom of thousands to know simply how to walk out the door properly, to know simply how to relate to our own loved ones in a time of total chaos? So that's what I wanted to leave you with. This is where I'm going with all of this. The classics are a very important part of our cultural education, of our becoming human, but they are not the end. In the concluding video, I want to talk about a general worldview question of how we encounter the world in stories and why the modern world really doesn't like anymore the idea of a hero going on a journey, and how that might be a good thing and how that is definitely a bad thing, and what we might do about it, and how we might use that information to inform the way that we encounter the news stories that are being told. Because I'm not suggesting that you turn off all new books, all new stories that are coming across your plate. There's some beautiful things being written, being told, being filmed right now that will eventually become classics, depending on how, of course, they are collectively accepted by a large number of people. But I honestly do believe that's the case. So as we venture outside of the comforting world of fairy tales, epic poetry, and the classics into the very dangerous and chaotic world of modern storytelling, there are certain maps that you need and certain rules that you need to follow in order not to get lost very, very quickly. That's what I'm going to be talking about in the next video. Thanks so much for joining me today.